We just finished smallpox, and our next set of viral skin infections are caused by herpes viruses. Some of these, not unlike HPV, some of these are sexually transmitted, and if you go back and look at the graphic I showed you with incidence and prevalence of sexually transmitted infections, you will find some of these on there. And again, I put them in this lecture so that the pressure will not be on you as bad on the last day of the term. Herpes viruses, people giggle when they hear the word herpes, but the biologists and people who know viruses are fascinated by these. It's a huge, very successful group of viruses. Many viruses are in this family. A virus family ends in these letters. So the Herpesviridae is the family of herpes viruses. All of them have this in common. They are enveloped, icosahedral, they have double-stranded DNA genomes, and they're large. This is a picture of a host cell with 5 visible virions in it. So if you're wondering about the difference in size between a host cell and a virion, well, in this case, they're not much smaller than the virion. That's because they're 200 nanometers across compared to 30 for Precorniviridae, which would be like this. So that really would be dwarfed by the cell. Anyway, one thing many herpes viruses do is enter a long-term latent state. And it's highly likely that any human on Earth has at least one herpes virus latent in them right now. So, herpes viruses, what can they do? Latency, they're so good at it. They can hide in our sensory ganglia and stay there until somehow reactivated. And that reactivation is poorly understood, but it has to do with stress. So any of the things that can cause stress can be a trigger for these viruses to reactivate. Reactivation occurs in a small subset of patients. In most patients, their entire life, they will never know that they have this virus again. What these viruses want to do is hide and just ride along. And in many cases, they're successful if a virion is still alive 40 years later. Herpes viruses have some similar cytopathic effects. A lot of them cause blisters or vesicles because they damage the epithelium, as I will show you. And a lot of herpes viruses will create multinucleated giant cells. So they will cause our cells to fuse and become giant cells with a lot of nuclei. So let's look at it. Histology, love it. So this is a giant cell with many nuclei. All around it, normal cells with one nucleus. And so this would be like one cell, one cell. So that's that. This is an epidermis destroyed by a herpes virus. So if you look over here, this is normal epidermis and dermis. Stratum corneum up here, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum. Down here we can see the layer of stem cells. And this sloughing of the keratinized layer is an artifact of the process they use to make these slides. So that doesn't mean anything. But it's this part all looks normal. When we get over here, where is the epithelium? Well, the virus has caused cells to die all through the stratum spinosum in this case. And so all those cells that should be growing and constantly replacing the ones superficial to them, they are dying. And in their place, this starts to accumulate fluid, and that becomes a blister. So that's one thing many of them do. There are a lot of diseases caused by herpes viruses. So, for example, these are the ones that we think of as skin diseases primarily, including cold sores around the mouth, genital herpes, neonatal herpes, and then chickenpox and shingles. These are caused by the same virus. Shingles is what happens when it reactivates. Chickenpox is what happens when it first infects a person. There are also diseases we will cover when we look at blood and lymph, Epstein-Barr virus and cytomegalovirus. And then there are some other skin diseases we skip that cause, well, in this case, it causes a cancer. Kaposi sarcoma is a cancer caused by a herpes virus. These are less common. These are extremely common. Well, all of these are extremely common except these two and neonatal herpes. This is a disaster when it happens, but things like cold sores aren't. Here's a phylogenetic tree of the Herpesviridae, and I'm going to show you this same tree again on the next slide, but I just want to remind you of what you're looking at. So each of these is an abbreviation for a specific herpes virus, and they're grouped, well, in each case, what we're doing is saying how similar is this one to, say, this one. So what you do is you find the path that connects this one to this one. So in this case, it's down to here, and then here, 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 and then here. So that's the path. And what you do is you measure the total length in this direction. So it's this length plus this length plus this tiny length plus this long length plus this length. That tells you how many genetic differences there are between this strain and that strain. Notice what I did not include in that. I did not include this length. This length is only here to physically separate them so that we can see them all. So this length doesn't tell us anything, this doesn't tell us anything, this doesn't tell us anything, this doesn't tell us anything. It's only these horizontal lines whose lengths matter to us. So here it is again, and now it's annotated with the diseases. So herpes simplex viruses 1 and 2, HSV1 typically causes the oral herpes, and HSV2 causes genital herpes, but realistically they can both cause the other. These can be interchangeable, though they do more commonly do those things that I just mentioned. This is Varicella-Zoster virus that causes chickenpox and shingles, cytomegalovirus, Epstein-Barr. So do with this what you will. I just want you to remember what phylogenetic trees are and how we know how these things are related. We are comparing their DNA sequences and looking and counting the differences between their DNA sequences. Okay, so let's look first at oral herpes infections. Both of the herpes simplex viruses can cause these, but HSV1 is more common. When we have one of these, we get a cold sore or a small vesicle that forms on the lip. And typically this will go away of its own accord. To prevent getting the virus, you would have to avoid touching people. And I guess the worst complication of this would be keratitis, where it could infect I believe the cornea. And so this can be a cause of blindness. So again, don't touch people. Let's see. Cold sores lead to latency. So what you'll see with a person is they'll typically get a cold sore during a stressful time. But the rest of the time, the virus is in the ganglia near the lips. And there are lots of different types of stress, like ultraviolet light being shined on your lips is a way to reactivate these viruses. Genital herpes, again, caused by these same two strains, but HSV2 is much more common for genital herpes. And these cause blisters wherever there is contact. And those blisters are infectious. And so if they aren't painful an infected person wouldn't know they were there necessarily. And so latency is common for this, and that's common again to all the herpes viruses. A person who has a recurrence of genital herpes and has the vesicles forming in their genitals is more susceptible to other sexually transmitted infections during that time. We have treatments for genital herpes. There are anti-herpetic drugs. Acyclovir is the most famous one, and it can do things like shorten the duration of symptoms and make a person less likely to transmit it. What it does is interfere with DNA synthesis. And so we might say, well, why doesn't that kill our cells? Well, this is not the actual drug. It has to be activated by an enzyme inside herpes particles. So the herpes virions have an enzyme that will convert this into a form that mimics a nucleotide. So this looks like a nitrogenous base, but it isn't. And when herpes is going to copy its genome, this will get incorporated and it will, the DNA will break. And so what this drug does, what all these related cyclovir drugs do, is damage the DNA. And so when the virus goes to make new virions, it doesn't work. So we have these drugs. We know that viruses can become resistant to antiviral drugs. So we want to limit the use of this. So if someone with cold sores is not likely to get one of these drugs unless they're very rich and they have a private doctor. There are vaccines. I'm not aware of any that are currently available. One of the biggest complications of genital herpes is neonatal herpes, because infected mothers can pass the virus to the newborn, I believe, during the birthing process. So if there are actual blisters in the birth canal, the newborn is at high risk of contracting herpes. And so a newborn who's born with this has a high risk of delayed mental development and blindness and other neurological problems. And so it is somewhat common. 1 out of roughly 3,000 to 4,000 infants in the US is born with herpes. If the mother knows that she has genital herpes, birth by cesarean section is a very effective way to prevent neonatal herpes. I don't know how common this is, but I know that some women are given acyclovir or related drugs prophylactically before they give birth to make transmission less likely, even if they don't know if they're infected or not. That can be useful. Herpes is a Torch's pathogen, so it is passed from mother to child vertically, and these are the major Torch's pathogens. One thing I will point out is herpes and the cytomegalovirus. These are both herpes viruses. So this is herpes simplex, cytomegalovirus. And we will cover all of these. In fact, today we're covering these, and we will also cover rubella. Let's see, I mentioned that. People with compromised immune systems see unusual forms of different diseases, and so herpes simplex 1 and 2 can cause systemic infections in people who don't have an immune response against them. And encephalitis is a possibility, but it's rare. Let's see. Another herpes virus is the Varicella-Zoster virus. This causes chickenpox and shingles. Again, it's from the Herpesviridae, so enveloped, double-stranded DNA viruses with large icosahedral capsids. And this is bizarre. A person gets this, they have a high likelihood of getting a disease, chickenpox, that is visible. They're sick and they have blisters all over their body. And then for decades, this virus will hide. and then reactivate many decades later in the form of a different disease. That reactivation is called shingles, and I don't know that it's even fully understood how the reactivation happens. We also don't understand fully how the virus is able to hide for so long. So the diseases. Chickenpox is the first one, and it was one of the most common childhood diseases. People my age all got chickenpox. It was not something we could avoid. It was so common that the extremely rare complications were all visible. So 100 kids would die every year in the US from chickenpox, from complications due to chickenpox. Things like encephalitis. And so in the US now, after 1995, we have a vaccine that prevents it. And this is a great thing because we have a vaccine that can prevent chickenpox, so the person will never get the infection in the first place. And there's a separate vaccine for people like me who've had chickenpox to prevent shingles. Shingles we'll get to in a minute, but nobody wants to get shingles. Let's see. Yeah, so chickenpox is spread by respiratory droplets and leads to characteristic vesicles. This is things I've already said. This is a little more detail you could look at. And these are the rare complications. So I think this is all things you've seen. Ideally, when you leave a microbiology class, you see smallpox everywhere. And you see every possible bioweapon. And you're just ready to identify them and ready to report them if you see them. The problem is chickenpox in some places is still common. So how do you know if you see a person covered with blisters? How do you know whether it's chickenpox or smallpox? There are these differences, and I'm going to show you a series of pictures with side-by-side comparisons of people at the same stage of the respective diseases. But these are differences you could look for. So early on, smallpox you might see vesicles earlier, and they would earlier be bigger, and you'd already be seeing dimples in some of them. Right. And as a person with chickenpox would see them starting to go away, a person with smallpox would not. They'd be getting bigger. And after a week, the person with smallpox is partway through their illness, and a person with chickenpox is recovering. You have to go into something like 2 weeks to see the smallpox vesicles scabbing over. And the same thing is happening to the chickenpox vesicles, but that started days earlier. Hopefully you'll never see either of these again. So I mentioned shingles. Shingles, again, is the reactivated form of the Varicella-Zoster virus, and it causes blisters, headaches, paralysis, and extreme pain. So a person with shingles will feel like they're being stabbed in a very specific part of the body. And the part of the body that gets affected by this is the part that is innervated by whatever nerve the virus was hiding in. And even after the blisters disappear, the pains will persist. So that's obnoxious and very, it can be debilitating. This is showing how a dermatome, or an area of skin innervated by one particular spinal nerve, will all get, shingles will erupt there. So I believe that is T3, I think. And it's just on one side, because Varicella-Zoster is going to be hiding in the dorsal root ganglion. And so that is the the cell bodies of the neurons, the sensory neurons that are going to innervate this part of the body. So for whatever reason, when they reactivate, those virions travel the length of that sensory neuron and then go to all these different parts of the skin and damage it. And they also damage something about the sensory neuron that leads to those pains. So again, we have a vaccine that has reduced the cases by a lot. So a lot of people don't get chickenpox now, and that's great. Right. So that's enough about the herpes viruses. We will come back to those later in the term when we look at the ones that are not skin related. And I'll see you at the next video.